Have you ever lost so much that starting over felt like the only option left? Reed Mallory sat in his empty apartment at 47, holding divorce papers and a termination letter, wondering how his life had come to this. With his daughter's blessing, he bought a piece of forgotten forest land and an old cabin that hadn't seen life in decades. The place was falling apart, rotted wood, shattered windows, floors you couldn't trust to hold your weight. Most men would have turned around and driven home, but Reed picked up a hammer and started tearing into those old walls. What he found changed everything. Hand-carved beams, hidden letters, stories from families long gone, and what he built became something nobody expected. So what did this broken father create that ended up healing so many others? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra. The morning Reed Mallory arrived at the property. The sky hung low and grey, pressing down on the forest like a heavy blanket. October had turned cold early that year, and the 2-hour drive from the city had given him plenty of time to question every decision that had led him here. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes back, forcing him to rely on handwritten directions from the county clerk's office. When he finally found the overgrown access road, he had to get out twice to move fallen branches blocking his path. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from a fading photograph. Reed stopped his truck 50 feet away and just sat there, engine idling, hands gripping the steering wheel. The structure leaned slightly to the left, as if exhausted from decades of standing. Moss covered the roof in thick patches of green and brown. The porch sagged in the middle, its railing broken in several places. 2 windows on the front face had lost their glass entirely, leaving dark openings that reminded Reed of empty eye sockets. This was what $8,000 and a decade of back taxes had bought him. This was his fresh start. His phone buzzed. Carly, he'd been expecting her call. "Dad, did you make it?" "I'm here," Reed said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "And how does it look?" Reed stared at the cabin. Like it's been waiting a long time for someone to care about it. There was a pause on the other end. When Carly spoke again, her voice was softer. "That's very poetic, Dad. Is it awful?" "It's a project. You don't have to do this, you know. You could come stay with me for a while. I have the space. You have a 1-bedroom apartment in the city, sweetheart. And you're 25. The last thing you need is your father sleeping on your couch." "I wouldn't mind." Reed felt something tighten in his chest. 6 months ago, he wasn't sure Carly would have made that offer. 6 months ago, they'd barely been speaking. The divorce had opened wounds between them that went back years. Her childhood years, when Reed had worked 60-hour weeks at the manufacturing plant, missing recitals and parent-teacher conferences and entire weekends. When her mother left, Carly had been 18 and already half gone herself, 1 foot out the door toward college and a life that didn't include her absent father. But something had shifted during the mediation sessions. Maybe it was seeing him vulnerable for the first time. Maybe it was her own maturity. Whatever the reason, Carly had started calling more, asking how he was doing, actually listening to his answers. When he'd mentioned the cabin, half joking, showing her the listing online, she'd surprised him by saying, "I think you should do it. I know you wouldn't mind," Reed said now. "But I need to do this. For me?" "Okay," Carly said. "But you call me if you need anything. And I mean anything, Dad, even if it's just to talk. I will. I promise." After she hung up, Reed sat in the truck for another 5 minutes. Then he turned off the engine, pocketed the keys, and stepped out into the cold morning air. The property was larger than he'd expected from the survey maps. Nearly 20 acres of mixed forest, mostly pine and fir, with a creek he could hear but not yet see somewhere to the east. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, surrounded by scrub brush and saplings that had taken advantage of the neglect. A stone chimney rose from the center of the roof, still intact but listing at a dangerous angle. Reed approached slowly, testing each porch step before trusting it with his full weight. The 3rd step cracked under him but held. The front door hung crooked on one hinge. He pushed it open carefully, and it scraped across the floor with a sound like a sigh. The smell hit him first, damp wood, animal musk, decades of decay. Dust motes swirled in the weak light, coming through the broken windows. The main room was smaller than he'd imagined, maybe 15 by 20 feet. A rusted wood stove sat in one corner, its pipe disconnected and lying on the floor. What had once been furniture was now just shapes under collapsed fabric and rot. The floorboards were water-stained and buckled in several places, and Reed could see daylight through gaps in the far wall. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, breathing through his mouth, taking it all in. 25 years he'd worked at Meridian Manufacturing. Started as a floor supervisor at 22, worked his way up to production manager by 30. He'd been good at his job, great at it actually. He understood systems and efficiency and how to get the best out of people. He'd helped modernize 3 different production lines, save the company millions in waste reduction. His bosses had loved him, right up until the private equity firm bought them out and decided the entire operation could be moved overseas for 1/3 of the cost. The severance package had been decent. The divorce settlement had taken most of it. Reed had spent 2 months sending out resumes, sitting through interviews where people 20 years younger than him asked questions about digital integration and agile methodologies. He'd watched their eyes glaze over when he talked about his experience, seen them mentally writing him off as yesterday's manager trying to compete in tomorrow's market. The last interview, he'd walked out halfway through, just stood up, thanked them for their time and left. He'd sat in his car in the parking lot and realized he didn't want to do this anymore, any of it. The resume polishing, the forced optimism, the pretending that his quarter-century of experience meant something to people who valued coding skills over human judgment. That night, he'd started searching for cheap land, not to build something new but to find something old, something that needed the kind of work he actually knew how to do, work with his hands, work where results were visible and real. Now, standing in the wreckage of someone else's abandoned dream, Reed felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, that would be too strong a word. But possibility? The cabin was broken, yes. But broken things could be fixed. He knew that much. He'd spent his entire career fixing broken systems, broken processes, broken machinery. Maybe he could fix this. He walked carefully across the floor, testing each board before stepping. The kitchen area was separated from the main room by a half wall that had mostly collapsed. A porcelain sink hung at an angle disconnected from any plumbing. Cabinet doors lay scattered on the floor. When Reed pulled at a loose floorboard near what had been the counter, it came up easily in his hands. And that's when he saw it. Tucked in the space between the floor joists was a book. Not a book exactly, a ledger. Leather-bound, maybe 8 by 10 inches. The leather cracked and stained, but intact. Reed lifted it carefully and carried it to the window where the light was better. The cover was unmarked. He opened it to the first page, where careful handwriting recorded a date, January 15th, 1947. Below that, in the same precise script, J. Brennan, Expenses and Records. Reed turned the page. Columns of numbers, dates, brief descriptions. Nails, bunt 50s, flour, 50 labies, 320, glass panes, 6 germ. He flipped forward slowly, carefully. Page after page of accounting. Every penny spent, every supply purchased, every small expense of building a life in this place. And scattered among the numbers, brief notes. Roof complete. Thank God. First snow. Ready for it. Miriam says the kitchen is perfect. Reed sat down on the least damaged section of floor, the ledger in his lap, and kept reading. Someone had lived here. Someone had built this place with their own hands, tracked every nail and board, carved out a life in these woods. Someone named J. Brennan, who had a wife named Miriam, who had fought to make something lasting in this clearing. And then they'd left, or died, or given up. Reed didn't know why that mattered to him, but it did. This wasn't just a cheap piece of property anymore. It was a story half-finished, a project abandoned, a dream deferred. He closed the ledger carefully and looked around the ruined cabin with new eyes. "Okay," he said aloud to the empty room, to the ghost of J. Brennan, to himself. "Let's see what we can do." 2 weeks into his stay at the cabin, Reed had established a rhythm that felt almost meditative. Wake at dawn, when the light filtered grey through the plastic sheeting he'd tacked over the broken windows. Coffee made on a camp stove outside. Work until his hands cramped or the light failed. Eat something simple from his cooler. Sleep in the back corner of the main room, where he'd cleared enough space for his sleeping bag and a camping pad. The physical exhaustion helped. Every night he collapsed into sleep without the hours of restless thinking that had plagued him in the city. His body ached in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Shoulders, back, hands that throbbed even after he'd soaked them in ice-cold creek water. But it was honest pain, earned pain. He was doing something real. The cabin was revealing itself slowly. He'd patched the worst of the roof leaks with salvaged plywood and tar paper, cleared the debris from inside, sorting what could be saved from what needed burning, reinforced the floor joists in 3 places where rot had compromised the structure. The porch was next. He'd already pulled up the damaged boards and was measuring for replacements. He'd also been reading the ledger every night by lantern light, learning about Jay Brennan and his family. Joseph he'd learned from later entries. Joseph and Miriam Brennan, who'd come west in 1946 with dreams of self-sufficiency and freedom. They'd had children. Mentions of Samuel and Ruth appeared in later entries, along with expenses for cloth diapers and baby food. Reed found himself caring about these people he'd never met, wondering what had happened to them, why they'd left this place they'd worked so hard to build. On Friday afternoon, his truck tires crunched on the gravel access road, and Reed looked up from the porch joists to see Carly's compact car navigating the ruts and holes. His heart lifted in a way that surprised him. She parked next to his truck and got out, looking around with wide eyes. "Dad, oh my God, you actually did it." "Did what?" "Made it livable." She walked toward the cabin, taking in the patched roof, the cleared yard, the neat stack of salvaged lumber. "Last time we video called, I couldn't even see the building for all the brush." "It's coming along." Reed climbed down from the porch, suddenly self-conscious about his appearance. He'd been so focused on work he hadn't looked in a mirror in days. His hands were calloused and scarred, his clothes paint-stained and worn. But Carly was smiling. She hugged him, and Reed held on perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "You look different," she said, stepping back to study him. "Dirty." "Present?" She touched his shoulder. "You look like you're actually here, Dad, not just going through the motions." They spent the afternoon working together. Reed showed her how to measure and cut replacement porch boards while he handled the installation. They fell into an easy partnership, and Reed realized this might be the most time they'd spent together, just the two of them, since she was a child. As the sun dropped toward the tree line, they sat on the newly reinforced porch steps, sharing sandwiches Carly had brought from town. "Can I ask you something?" Carly said. "Of course. When you and Mom were together, were you happy?" Reed took a breath, considering his answer carefully. "I thought I was. But I think I confused being busy with being content. I kept thinking if I just worked a little harder, made a little more money, proved I could provide, then everything would be good. I'd be a good husband, a good father." "You were a good father," Carly said quietly. "I was an absent father. There's a difference. You're here now. Now doesn't erase then." Carly was quiet for a moment. "No, but it matters anyway." That night, after Carly had left with promises to return the following weekend, Reed lay in his sleeping bag thinking about her question. Had he been happy? He honestly didn't know. He'd been focused, driven, committed to being responsible. But happy? He'd loved his wife once, he was sure of that. But somewhere in the years of overtime shifts and missed dinners, they'd become strangers, sharing an apartment. And he'd been too busy, or too cowardly to acknowledge it, until she'd sat him down and said the words he'd been avoiding. "I don't think either of us wants this anymore." The next morning, Reed decided to tackle the attic space. He'd been putting it off, but the structure was sound enough now that he could safely access it. The ladder from the hardware store was new and sturdy, a sharp contrast to everything else in the cabin. The attic hatch was sealed tight, the wood swollen from years of humidity. Reed had to work a pry bar around the edges carefully, not wanting to damage the frame. When it finally gave way, a cascade of dust and dead leaves rained down on him. He climbed up carefully, testing each rung, and poked his head through the opening. The space was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 6 feet at the highest point of the roof peak, and dark. He pulled himself up, clicked on his flashlight, and swept the beam across the space. Most of the attic was empty except for mouse nests and cobwebs. But in the far corner, protected from the leaks by the angle of the roof, sat something covered in an old canvas tarp. Reed crawled across the rafters, mindful of his weight distribution, until he could reach the tarp. He pulled it back slowly, a cradle. Wooden, handmade, every joint perfectly fitted. The rails were carved with an intricate pattern of leaves and vines. On the headboard, initials, JB plus MB 1948. Reed sat back on his heels, the flashlight beam steady on the cradle. Joseph had made this, had carved every detail by hand, had fitted it together with the same care he'd put into building the cabin itself. Made it for a child, made it with love. Next to the cradle was a small wooden box, the kind that might have held jewelry or important papers. Reed opened it carefully. Baby clothes. Small hand-sewn garments in white and pale yellow. Never worn, the fabric was still crisp, the seams sharp. And underneath the clothes a letter folded and yellowed. Reed unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was different from Joseph's, more flowing, more delicate. Miriam's, he guessed. My dearest Grace, it began. I write this knowing you'll never read it, but I need to say these things. You were with us for only 3 days, but in that time you made us complete. Your father carved this cradle before you were born, spent every evening for 3 months, getting every detail perfect. He said you deserved something beautiful to sleep in, something that would last generations. Reed's throat tightened. The letter continued, describing the brief life and sudden death of an infant daughter, the grief that had nearly destroyed the marriage, the guilt Joseph carried, though the doctor said nothing could have been done, the slow healing that had come with time and the births of Samuel and Ruth. We will leave this place eventually, Miriam had written. The memories here are too heavy for us to carry every day. But I wanted to leave this behind, a marker that you existed, that you mattered. Whoever finds this, know that a family loved here and lost here, and somehow found the strength to continue. Reed sat in the attic for a long time, the letter in his hands, and cried. He cried for the Brennans and their lost daughter. He cried for the marriage he'd failed to save. He cried for all the moments he'd missed with Carly, the recitals and soccer games and parent-teacher conferences that had seemed less important than the next production deadline. When he finally climbed back down the ladder, his face was wet and his chest felt hollowed out. But something had shifted. The cabin wasn't just a project anymore. It was a memorial, a testament to people who had suffered and survived and left something beautiful behind. That evening, Reed called Carly. I need to tell you something, he said when she answered. I need to apologize. Dad, we've been through this. No, please. Let me say it. He took a breath. I wasn't there for you. Not really. I was so focused on providing, on being responsible, on doing what I thought a father was supposed to do, that I forgot to actually be your father. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. There was silence on the other end, and then a small sound that might have been a sob. I thought, Carly's voice broke, I thought you didn't want to be around me, like I wasn't interesting enough or important enough. God, no. Carly, no. You were the most important thing in the world. I didn't know how to show it. I thought working hard was love, but it wasn't enough. They talked for an hour. About her childhood, about the distance between them, about the ways they'd both been hurt, and about the ways they could move forward. When Reed hung up, he felt exhausted but lighter. He walked outside and looked up at the stars, brighter here than they'd ever been in the city. The cabin had brought him here for a reason. He was starting to understand what it might be. The conversation with Carly changed something fundamental in Reed. He found himself working with new purpose, not just to restore the cabin, but to honor the story it held. He bought a hardcover journal from the general store in town and began documenting everything he found, photographing each artifact, recording where and when he'd discovered it. The tin box came 3 weeks after finding the cradle. Reed was repairing the fieldstone fireplace when one of the stones in the back wall shifted under his hand. Behind it, wedged into a gap between stones, was a tin box about the size of a shoebox, sealed with wax that had cracked with age. Inside were letters, dozens of them, organized by date with pieces of string. Reed carried the box outside where the light was better and began reading. The earliest letters were from Miriam's sister back in Pennsylvania, dated 1947. Cheerful notes about family gatherings and town gossip, asking when Miriam and Joseph would visit. Miriam's replies, carbon copies kept for her records, were optimistic. The cabin was coming along beautifully. Joseph was a marvel with tools. The children would love it here. But the tone shifted as the years progressed. By 1949, Miriam's letters mentioned the hardship. Winters that seemed endless, crops that failed, the isolation that wore on them both. Her sister's responses grew concerned, urging them to come home. Then there was a gap. No letters for 6 months in 1949. When they resumed, Miriam's handwriting looked different, shakier, smaller. She wrote about Grace's death briefly, clinically, as if emotion would shatter her if she let it through. Her sister's response was full of love and pleading, "Come home. Please come home. You don't have to stay there." But they had stayed. The later letters showed why. Joseph had thrown himself into rebuilding sections of the cabin. Miriam had found purpose in her garden and in raising Samuel and Ruth. They'd made a choice to transform their grief into something tangible. The final letter in the box was from 1953, from Miriam to her sister. "We've decided to leave. Joseph's lungs are bad. The doctor says the altitude and cold winters are making it worse. We'll move to California where he can work in a milder climate. But I want you to know we're not running away anymore. We've healed here as much as we can. This place gave us that gift, even with all its hardness." Reed sat with the letters spread around him on the porch and felt the weight of their story. They'd come here seeking a dream. They'd lost a child. They'd nearly lost each other. But somehow they'd found the strength to rebuild, to heal, to continue. He thought about his own journey. The divorce hadn't been bitter, just sad. Two people who drifted so far apart, they'd forgotten why they'd come together in the first place. He'd signed the papers feeling numb, relieved it was over, but empty about what came next. The job loss had been worse in some ways. His identity had been so wrapped up in being a production manager, in being good at what he did, that losing it felt like losing himself. Who was Reed Mallory if he wasn't the guy who solved problems and kept production lines running? But here, in this cabin, working with his hands and reading about the Brennans, he was discovering a different answer. Maybe he was someone who could honor other people's stories. Someone who could take broken things and make them whole again. That afternoon, Reed drove to the county seat, 45 minutes down winding mountain roads. The Historical Society was housed in a converted church on Main Street. Inside, the smell of old paper and dust reminded him of his elementary school library. An elderly woman looked up from behind the desk, her glasses hanging on a beaded chain around her neck. "Help you?" "I hope so. My name is Reed Mallory. They bought some property up in the National Forest Territory, old cabin that's been abandoned for decades. I've been finding artifacts, documents. I'm trying to learn more about the family who built it." The woman's expression shifted from polite disinterest to genuine curiosity. "Well now, that's the kind of project I like to hear about. I'm Phyllis Kendrick. I've been running this place for 32 years, and before that, I taught local history for 20 more. What's the family name?" "Brennan. Joseph and Miriam Brennan, sometime around 1947. Phyllis stood up, energized. "Give me a minute. I know that name." She disappeared into the back room and returned 10 minutes later with a folder and 2 bound volumes. "Found them. Not a lot, but something. Joseph Brennan bought land in 1946, right after the war. Filed a homestead claim. There are a few mentions in the county records. Births registered for the children, timber permits, that sort of thing." She opened one of the volumes to a page marked with a slip of paper. "Here's an interesting bit." There was a small article in the county newspaper from 1953 about families leaving the mountain homesteads. Listed Joseph Brennan among them. Said he was moving his family to California for work. Mentions he was a skilled carpenter. "Do you know what happened to them after they left?" I might be able to find out. We have access to genealogy databases now. Internet age has made this kind of research much easier. Phyllis pulled out a notepad. Give me your contact information. I'll do some digging. Reed wrote down his cell number and email, though he explained the cabin had no internet service. I'd really appreciate anything you can find. I'm trying to preserve what they left behind. Honor their memory somehow. Phyllis studied him over her glasses. That's good work you're doing. Most people who buy those old places just tear them down and start fresh. It matters that you care about the history. Driving back to the cabin, Reed felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to admit. This wasn't just about having a place to live or a project to keep him busy. This was about connection to the past, to people he'd never met, to the fundamental human story of building something that lasts. Over the next 2 weeks, Reed worked on the cabin with renewed dedication. He reinforced the foundation, replaced rotted sill plates, rebuilt the chimney stone by stone. Every repair was done carefully, using materials and techniques as close to the original as possible. This wasn't just restoration, it was preservation. Carly visited again, bringing her camera. She photographed everything, the cabin's progress, the artifacts Reed had found, Reed himself working with Joseph's ledger open beside him for reference. "You should share this story," she said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set through the pines. "What do you mean?" "I mean people would want to know about this. About the Brennans, about what you're doing here. It's a beautiful story, Dad." Reed shook his head. "This is private. It's not for, I'm not saying make it a tourist attraction. But stories like this matter. They remind people that their struggles aren't unique, that other people have survived hard things and come out the other side." She showed him her camera screen, scrolling through the photos. Reed barely recognized himself. Tanned, leaner, his face more lined but somehow younger. And the cabin looked almost noble in her shots, the evening light catching the restored logs and making them glow. "Let me think about it," Reed said. That night he sat in the workshop area he'd been slowly clearing and cleaning. The space was taking shape. Workbench rebuilt, tools organized, a small wood stove installed for heat. He opened his journal and began writing. "I came here broken, thinking I needed to get away from everything. But maybe what I really needed was to find something worth caring about. The Brennans built this cabin as an act of faith. They believed they could make a life here. When that life turned tragic, they had a choice, abandon it or rebuild. They chose to rebuild. I'm starting to understand that's always the choice. Give up or keep going. Let the broken things stay broken, or find the courage to make them whole again." He closed the journal and looked around the workshop. Joseph had stood here, had used these tools, had made beautiful things with his hands. And now Reed was here, continuing that work in his own way. The phone in his pocket buzzed. A text from Phyllis. "Found something." "Call me tomorrow," Reed smiled. The story was still unfolding, and he was part of it now. Phyllis answered on the second ring. "Reed, good news. I found them." Reed's heart jumped. "The Brennans?" "Well, the children. Samuel passed away in 2019. There's an obituary in the Sacramento Bee, but Ruth is still alive. She's 78, lives in a retirement community in Eugene, Oregon. I found her through the genealogy database. Samuel's obituary listed her as a surviving sibling." Reed sat down on the porch steps, phone pressed to his ear. "Do you have contact information?" "I do, but Reed, this is delicate. She might not want to be contacted. Those memories might be painful. I understand. But I have things that belong to her family. Things I think she'd want to know about." Phyllis was quiet for a moment. "You're a good man, Reed Mallory. I'll email you her address and phone number. But promise me you'll be gentle about this. Approach it carefully." "I promise." After the call ended, Reed sat staring at the forest. Ruth Brennan was alive. The little girl mentioned in the ledger, who'd survived the death of her baby sister, who'd left this cabin at age 7 or 8, was a real person living in Oregon. What would she remember? Would she even want to hear from him? When Carly arrived that weekend, Reed showed her the information Phyllis had sent. Together they sat at the makeshift table Reed had built and drafted a letter. It took 6 attempts to get it right. Too formal felt cold. Too casual felt presumptuous. Finally, they settled on simple honesty. "Dear Ruth," it began, "my name is Reed Mallory. I recently purchased the property in the forest where your family lived in the late 1940s and early 1950s. As I've been restoring the cabin your father built, I've discovered several items I believe belong to your family. A ledger, letters, photographs, and other personal effects. I wanted to reach out because I felt you should know these things exist and to ask if you'd like to have them returned to you. More than that, I wanted you to know that your family's home is being cared for and respected. Your parents built something beautiful here, and I'm honored to be able to preserve it. If you'd like to talk or if you'd ever want to visit, I would welcome the opportunity to meet you and share what I've found." He included his phone number and email, along with photos of the cabin's current state and some of the artifacts. Carly drove him to the post office in town to mail it. As Reed dropped the envelope in the slot, he felt a flutter of nervousness. He was inviting the past into his present, and he had no idea what that might mean. What if she doesn't respond? He asked Carly on the drive back. "Then you tried. That matters. What if she's angry I disturbed things that were meant to stay hidden?" Carly looked at him steadily. "Dad, you've spent 2 months treating their story with nothing but respect. You're not disturbing anything. You're honoring it." Back at the cabin, Reed threw himself into work while waiting for Ruth's response. The kitchen was his next project. He'd torn out the rotted cabinets and was rebuilding them using reclaimed wood from a demolition site in town. The work was precise and demanding, requiring his full attention, which helped keep his mind from spinning in circles. One afternoon, while measuring for a cabinet door, he discovered another artifact. A small wooden box had been wedged between 2 wall studs, visible only after he'd removed the old cabinet frame. Inside was a wedding photograph, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Joseph and Miriam on their wedding day, 1946. They looked impossibly young. Joseph in a dark suit, his hair slicked back, eyes serious but kind. Miriam in a simple white dress, holding a small bouquet, her smile radiant. Behind them, a church and trees just beginning to leaf out. Spring, Reed guessed, before everything that would come after, the hard years, the loss, the grief, the healing. He stared at the photograph for a long time, these people who had become so real to him. They'd been younger than Carly when they married, younger than Reed when they'd built this cabin and started their family. What courage that must have taken to head west with nothing but hope and each other. Reed thought about his own wedding 26 years ago. He and his wife had been young too, full of plans and dreams. When had it all gotten away from them? There was no single moment he could point to, no dramatic fight or betrayal. Just a slow drift, like a boat pulling away from a dock, so gradually you don't notice until the shore is too far to reach. He'd loved her once. He was certain of that. But had he loved her well? Had he shown up, been present, done the daily work of actually being a partner? Carly found him that evening sitting on the porch with the photograph in his hands. She sat beside him without speaking, and they watched the light fade together. "I wasn't a good husband," Reed said finally. "I keep thinking about it. I provided, sure, paid the bills, kept the house maintained. But I wasn't there. Not really. Just like I wasn't there for you. Dad, no, let me finish." Looking at this photograph, seeing how young they were, how hopeful, it makes me think about all the ways I failed at that. I thought being responsible meant working all the time. I thought if I just kept the money coming in, that was enough. But it wasn't. Your mother needed a partner, not just a provider. And she deserved better than what I gave her. Carly was quiet for a moment. "Have you talked to her?" "Since the divorce?" "A few times. Logistics mostly. Signing papers, dividing assets. Maybe you should call her. Not to get back together or anything, but just to, I don't know, find some peace with it." Reed turned the photograph over in his hands. "Maybe you're right." That night he drafted an email to his ex-wife. Like the letter to Ruth, it took several attempts. He wasn't looking for reconciliation or forgiveness. He just wanted her to know he understood his failures, that he took responsibility, that he hoped she was finding happiness. He sent it before he could overthink it further. 2 weeks passed with no word from Ruth. Reed tried not to obsess over it, but found himself checking his phone constantly, listening for the mail truck on the access road. He completed the kitchen cabinets, installed new windows throughout the cabin, and began work on the bedroom area. Then on a Tuesday morning in early November, his phone rang. Unknown number, Oregon area code. Reed's hand shook as he answered.
Hello?
Is this Reed Mallory? A woman's voice, older, warm. Yes, this is Reed. This is Ruth Brennan. Well, Ruth Wilkins now. I got your letter. She paused, and Reed heard emotion in her voice. I can't tell you what it means to know someone is caring for that place. I've so many questions. Would you have time to talk? Reed sat down on the porch steps, a smile spreading across his face. I have all the time in the world. They talked for over an hour. Ruth's memories of the cabin were fragmentary. She'd been so young when they left. But she remembered the smell of the wood stove, the sound of her father working in the early morning, the way her mother sang while cooking. She remembered feeling safe there, despite the hardships her parents faced. I'd like to visit, Ruth said as the conversation wound down. In the spring, when the roads are better. Would that be all right? It would be an honor, Reed said. After they hung up, Reed sat in the gathering darkness, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not just purpose, but connection. He was part of a story larger than himself, and that story was still being written. Winter arrived in earnest the week after Ruth's call. Reed woke one morning to find 6 inches of snow blanketing the property, the pines heavy and sagging under white weight. The cabin, now properly insulated and weatherproofed, held heat from the wood stove through the night. Reed made coffee and stood at the window watching dawn break over the transformed landscape. He'd been at the cabin for nearly 4 months. In that time, the place had changed dramatically, but so had he. His reflection in the window showed a different man than the one who'd arrived in October, leaner, weathered, calloused hands wrapped around the coffee mug. But the real changes were internal, harder to see but more profound. The workshop was where Reed spent most of his time now. He'd fully restored the space, and one afternoon while rebuilding the workbench, he'd found them, Joseph's tools, hidden in a compartment beneath the bench surface. The compartment had been deliberately constructed, carefully concealed, protecting what must have been Joseph's most valuable possessions. The tools were old but beautifully maintained, handplanes with rosewood handles worn smooth from years of use. Chisels in graduated sizes, their edges still sharp. A dovetail saw with brass fittings, a brace and bit set. Each tool spoke of craftsmanship, of work done with care and precision. Reed lifted each one reverently, examining it in the winter light. These had been in Joseph's hands. These had built the cabin, made the cradle, created all the details Reed had been discovering and documenting. He could almost feel the connection across time, one craftsman to another. He began using Joseph's tools for the restoration work. There was something profound about continuing the cabin's story with the same implements that had started it. When Reed planed a board smooth or cut a joint, he used Joseph's hand plane, Joseph's saw. The work felt less like restoration and more like collaboration. Phyllis visited in mid-November, driving her old Subaru carefully up the snowy access road. Reed gave her a complete tour, showing her everything he'd discovered and documented. She photographed the artifacts, took notes, asked careful questions. "This is remarkable work, Reed," she said, standing in the main room and turning slowly to take it all in. "You've created something special here. I've just been trying to preserve what was already here." "No, it's more than that. You've brought this story back to life." She pulled out a business card. "I took the liberty of contacting someone at the State Historical Preservation Office. Her name is Fiona Keller. She'd like to come document this place, possibly get it listed on the State Register of Historic Places." Reed felt a flutter of anxiety. "I don't know if I want it to become some kind of official site. This feels personal, I understand. But consider this. If something happened to you, what would happen to all of this? The cabin, the artifacts, the story? Historical designation would protect it, and there are grants available for preservation projects. You've put your own money into this place. Some support might be welcome." She wasn't wrong. Reed's savings were dwindling faster than he'd planned. Materials weren't cheap, and winter was making everything more expensive and difficult. "Let me think about it," Reed said. "That's all I ask. But Reed, this story deserves to be protected. What you're doing matters. The first serious storm hit in early December. Snow fell for 3 days straight, accumulating to nearly 2 feet. Reed was completely cut off, the access road impassable even with four-wheel drive. He had enough supplies to last weeks. He'd learned to prepare for isolation, but the enforced solitude was different from chosen solitude. On the second day of the storm, Reed found himself thinking about his father. Richard Mallory had been a mechanic, a man of few words and high expectations. Reed had spent his childhood trying to earn approval that never quite came. Nothing was ever good enough. Grades, sports performance, later his choice of career and wife. His father had died 10 years ago without ever telling Reed he was proud of him. Reed had sworn he wouldn't be that kind of father. Yet somehow he'd become absent in a different way. Not critical, but simply not there. Different method, same result. A daughter who'd grown up wondering if she mattered to her father. The weight of generational failure pressed on him in the storm's silence. His grandfather had been distant with his father. His father had been distant with him. He'd been distant with Carly. How many generations back did this pattern go? How many sons and daughters had grown up in the shadow of fathers who didn't know how to show love? Reed pulled out his journal and began writing. Not just documentation of the cabin's restoration, but something deeper. A letter to Carly about the patterns he was finally seeing. The wounds he'd inherited and then passed down. The cycle he desperately wanted to break. He wrote about his own father, stories he'd never shared with Carly before. The rare moments of connection, teaching Reed to change oil, to read a measuring tape, to fix a leaking faucet. Small things, but they were what his father had to offer. Not affection or verbal approval, but practical knowledge, tangible skills. "I did the same thing with you," Reed wrote. "I thought teaching you to be responsible, to work hard, to be self-sufficient was love. And those things matter. But they're not enough. You needed me to show up at your school plays. You needed me to ask about your day and actually listen to the answer. You needed me to be present, not just providing. I'm sorry it took me 47 years and losing everything to figure that out." He wrote about the Brennans, about Joseph's guilt over the cabin he'd built. How that guilt had nearly destroyed him and his marriage. How Joseph had found redemption through the act of rebuilding, of making things right through honest work. "I can't go back and fix the past," Reed wrote, "but like Joseph, I can rebuild. Not just this cabin, but the relationship that matters most, the one with you. That's what this place has taught me. Broken things can be made whole again if you're willing to do the work." When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, Reed drove to town and mailed the letter. Then he called Carly. "I want you to come for Christmas," he said. "Spend a few days here. I'll cook, we'll work on the cabin together, we'll just be together. No agenda, no pressure, just us." Carly's voice was thick with emotion. "I'd love that, Dad." "Good. And Carly, I love you. I should say that more often. I love you too." After the call, Reed stood in the town square, looking at Christmas decorations strung between the streetlights. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to the holiday, not as an obligation or a tradition to get through, but as a genuine opportunity for connection. He stopped at the hardware store and bought materials for a project he'd been planning, a display case for some of the artifacts. If Ruth was coming in the spring, he wanted everything properly preserved and presented. Back at the cabin, Reed fired up the wood stove and returned to Joseph's workbench. Using Joseph's tools, he began building something new from old wood, continuing the story of restoration and renewal that had brought him here. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, covering everything in clean white silence. Christmas morning arrived clear and cold. Reed woke early, started the fire, and began preparing the cabin for Carly's arrival. He'd spent the previous 2 weeks making the place as comfortable as possible, setting up a proper guest sleeping area with a real bed frame he'd built, adding curtains Phyllis had helped him find at a thrift store, installing better lighting throughout. The cabin looked different now, not just restored but alive. The artifacts were displayed thoughtfully throughout. The ledger in a glass case Reed had built, the letters organized in acid-free folders, the wedding photograph framed and hanging above the fireplace. Miriam's recipe box sat on a shelf in the kitchen, and the quilt, carefully cleaned and repaired, was draped over the back of the reading chair Reed had refinished. He'd even decorated modestly. A small pine tree from the property stood in the corner, adorned with simple ornaments, carved wooden shapes Reed had made using Joseph's tools. It felt right, bringing life and celebration into this space that had known both joy and sorrow. Carly arrived mid-morning, her car packed with supplies and gifts. Reed helped her unload, and when she stepped inside and saw what he'd done, she stopped and put her hand to her mouth. "Dad, it's beautiful." "It's home," Reed said, and realized he meant it. They spent Christmas Day cooking together, using recipes from Miriam's box. The notes Miriam had written to herself were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Made this when Joseph was discouraged, it helped. Ruth's favorite makes us smile even on hard days. Remember to find joy in small things. She was trying so hard to hold everything together, Carly said, reading through the cards. Creating normalcy for her family, even when things were falling apart. Your grandmother did the same thing, Reed said. My mother. She held us together when my father's moods would darken. Made sure there was always dinner on the table, always clean clothes, always some small celebration even when money was tight. I never knew that about her. I never talked about it. But being here, reading Miriam's notes, it makes me see the patterns. The women in our families have always been the ones quietly holding things together, while the men were off being stoic and distant. They talked late into the night, sitting by the fireplace with mugs of tea. Reed told Carly stories about his childhood she'd never heard. She told him about struggles she'd been having, a recent breakup, uncertainty about her career path, fears about her own ability to maintain relationships. I'm scared I'm like you, she admitted. Like I'll end up so focused on work that I'll miss everything else that matters. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then you're already ahead of me. I didn't see the pattern until I'd lost everything. You're seeing it now, while you still have time to make different choices. How do I do that? I don't know if I'm qualified to give advice, sweetheart. I'm still figuring it out myself. But I think it starts with being honest about what you really want. Not what you think you should want, but what would actually make you happy. The next day, they worked together on the porch, building a bench from reclaimed lumber. It was peaceful, rhythmic work, measuring, cutting, fitting pieces together. Father and daughter side by side, creating something that would last. You know what's funny? Carly said as they sanded the bench smooth. You're a better father now, living in the woods by yourself, than you were when you lived 20 minutes away from me. Reed paused. What do you mean? You're present now. When we talk, you actually listen. When I visit, you're excited to see me. Before you were always distracted, thinking about work, checking your phone. I felt like an item on your to-do list. But now I feel like I matter. You always mattered, Carly, always. I know that now. But I didn't feel it then. The honesty hurt, but Reed was grateful for it. I'm sorry. I know you are. And I forgive you. But more than that, I'm proud of you. It takes real courage to change, Dad, especially at your age. At my age? Reed smiled. I'm not that old. You know what I mean. Most people get stuck in their patterns. You broke yours. That's huge. On Carly's last evening, they sat on the new bench and watched the sun set through the pines. The temperature was dropping fast, their breath visible in the cold air, but neither wanted to go inside yet. I've been documenting your journey, Carly said. Not in a weird way, I promise. Just photos and some writing. Stories about the cabin, the Brennans, what you're doing here. Reed felt a reflexive resistance. Carly, I haven't posted anything public. But I've been showing it to friends and Dad. People are really moved by it. Everyone knows someone who's going through something like this. Divorce, job loss, just feeling lost. And your story gives people hope. It's not my story. It's the Brennan story. I'm just the caretaker. It's both. That's what makes it powerful. The past and present. Restoration as metaphor and reality. She pulled out her phone and showed him a document she'd been working on. I've been thinking about what comes after the restoration. Once the cabin is done, then what? I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead. What if this became something bigger? A place for people who need what you needed, space to rebuild, to figure out who they are outside of their roles and responsibilities. Reed was quiet, considering. Like a retreat? Not exactly. More personal than that. What if people could come here for a month or two, the way you did? Work on the property, spend time in solitude, have space to process their lives. You could host a couple people at a time. Share the story of this place, give them tools, literally and figuratively, to do their own restoration work. I don't know anything about running something like that. You know about rebuilding. You know about finding purpose after loss. That's enough. She showed him more of her notes, ideas for structure, funding through donations and grants, word-of-mouth applications. We could do this together, Dad. I could handle the administrative side. You could be the heart of it. Reed felt fear and excitement in equal measure. What if I fail? What if people come here expecting something I can't give them? You're not a guru or a therapist. You're just someone who's lived through what they're living through. That's all they'd need, someone who understands. And a space that allows healing. He thought about the messages Ruth had shared during their phone calls, how many people she'd told about the cabin, how moved they'd been by the story. He thought about Joseph and Miriam, who'd built this place as an act of faith and had somehow survived tragedy because of it. "Let me meet Ruth first," Reed said finally. "Get her blessing. This is her family's legacy as much as mine. If she approves, then we can talk seriously about moving forward." Carly smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "That's fair." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the forest, both of them imagining possibilities neither had considered just months before. The metal box had been there all along, hidden beneath the hearthstone. Reed discovered it on a grey February morning while repairing the fireplace foundation. One of the hearthstones had developed a crack, and when Reed lifted it to assess the damage, he saw the edge of something metallic wedged in the gap beneath. The box was about the size of a shoebox, made of tin, with a tight-fitting lid, sealed with what looked like wax. Reed's hands trembled slightly as he carried it outside into better light. This felt different from the other discoveries, more deliberately hidden, more secret. He used a knife to carefully break the wax seal and lifted the lid. Inside was a leather journal, darker and more worn than the ledger. Reed opened it to the first page. Joseph's handwriting, but different from the careful accounting in the ledger. This was more rushed, more personal. January 1952, the first entry began. "I need to write this down because I can't carry it alone anymore, but I can't speak it aloud either. Miriam would never forgive me if she knew I was still dwelling on it. But I have to face the truth. Grace's death was my fault." Reed's breath caught. He sat down on the porch steps and kept reading. The entries that followed were devastating. Joseph had convinced himself that his construction choices had killed his daughter. He'd used green wood in places, hadn't properly ventilated the cabin during the first winter, had sealed the walls too tightly. He believed toxic mold had developed in the structure, that the infant had breathed it in during her short life. "I built her coffin before I built her cradle," Joseph wrote. "That's what I can't stop thinking about. I was so careful with every detail of that cradle, so proud of my work. But the cabin itself, I was rushing, cutting corners, trying to get it done before winter. And my impatience killed my daughter." The journal documented Joseph's spiral into guilt and near madness. He considered burning the cabin down. He withdrew from Miriam and the other children. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped seeing any value in himself or his work. Then in the summer of 1952, something shifted. Miriam had confronted him, forced him to speak his fears aloud. Her doctor had examined the cabin and found no evidence of mold or toxins. The baby's death, he explained, was one of those tragedies that sometimes happened without explanation or blame. Sudden infant death, mysterious and unavoidable. But Joseph couldn't simply let go of the guilt. Instead, he transformed it. He tore out entire sections of the cabin and rebuilt them. He improved ventilation, replaced questionable materials, reinforced every joint and beam. The restoration work of 1953 that Reed had been admiring wasn't just maintenance, it was penance. "I will make this place perfect," Joseph wrote. "Not for us because we're leaving. The altitude is hard on my lungs, and Miriam needs to be somewhere with other people, with support. But whoever comes after us will live in a cabin that is sound and safe and built with absolute care. That's all I can do now. Build it right, even if it's too late for Grace. The final entry was dated October 1953, just before the family left. I'm sealing this journal beneath the hearth because I don't want to carry it with me. This place holds my guilt and my redemption both. Let them stay here together. Whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, know that I failed and I tried to make it right. That's all any man can do. Reed sat with the journal for a long time, watching winter light move through the trees. The parallels between his story and Joseph's were overwhelming. Both men had built their lives around work, around providing, around the idea that what they made with their hands defined their worth. Both had failed the people they loved. Joseph through an accident he couldn't have prevented, Reed through choices he could have made differently, and both had found redemption through the act of rebuilding. But now Reed faced an impossible question. Should he tell Ruth? She was coming in April, just 2 months away. She'd be walking into her childhood home, expecting to reconnect with happy memories and honor her parents' legacy. Did she need to know that her father had spent years blaming himself for her sister's death? Did she have a right to that knowledge, even if it would cause pain? Reed called Phyllis that afternoon. He didn't reveal the specifics of what he'd found, but he asked her thoughts on truth versus kindness in historical preservation. That's the eternal question, isn't it? Phyllis said. I've been doing this work for 32 years, and I still don't have a perfect answer. But I can tell you this, secrets keep us sick. Even old secrets. Even secrets about people who are gone. The truth doesn't always feel kind in the moment, but it has a way of setting things right in the long run. That night, Reed made photocopies of the journal, placing the originals back in the metal box and returning it to its hiding place beneath the hearth. If Ruth wanted to see it, he'd show her. If not, it could stay hidden. But he wouldn't make the decision for her. He called Ruth the next day. I found something, he told her. Something your father wrote and hid. It's personal, and it's difficult. I'm not sure whether to share it with you when you visit, or whether some things are better left buried. Ruth was quiet for a moment. What does your gut tell you? That you have a right to know who your father really was. The whole truth of him, not just the parts that are comfortable. Then show me when I come, Ruth said. I'm 78 years old, Reed. I've lived long enough to know that our parents were human beings with their own struggles and failures. Whatever it is, I can handle it. After they hung up, Reed felt both relieved and anxious. He'd made his choice. Now he had to trust it was the right one. The rest of February and March passed in a blur of final preparations. Reed completed the last major restoration projects. The bedroom area was finished, the kitchen was functional and beautiful, every artifact was documented and displayed. He built a proper guest room in what had been the storage area, using reclaimed materials and Joseph's tools. Carly visited twice more, bringing supplies and helping plan for Ruth's visit. Together, they created a timeline of the cabin's history to show Ruth photographs, documents, and artifacts organized chronologically to tell the story of her family's time here. Are you nervous? Carly asked the night before Ruth's scheduled arrival. Terrified, Reed admitted. What if she hates what I've done? What if the journal revelation makes her angry? What if she thinks I'm exploiting her family's story? She won't think that. You've treated everything with such respect and care. Anyone can see that. I hope you're right. That night, Reed walked the property one last time, checking everything. The cabin glowed warm in the darkness, smoke rising from the chimney into the cold spring air. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. The creek, swollen with snowmelt, rushed over rocks with a sound like distant conversation. This place had become home in a way Reed had never expected. More than that, it had become a mission. Joseph had poured his redemption into these logs and stones, and now Reed had continued that work, adding his own story to the cabin's foundation. Tomorrow Ruth would arrive and see what he'd done, and then, together, they would decide what came next, whether this place would remain a private memorial or become something larger. a refuge for others who needed what Reed had found here. Space to grieve, to heal, to rebuild. Reed stood in the workshop, Joseph's tools hanging on the wall, and felt the weight of responsibility and possibility in equal measure. This was bigger than him now. The story had always been bigger than him. He was just the next chapter in something that had started long before, and would, if he did this right, continue long after. He locked the workshop and headed back to the cabin, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. April arrived with the tentative warmth of early spring. Reed spent the days before Ruth's visit in a state of nervous energy, checking and rechecking everything. He cleaned the cabin thoroughly, arranged fresh flowers from the valley in mason jars, made sure the guest room was perfect. Carly arrived 2 days early to help and to provide moral support. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor with all this pacing," she said, watching him move restlessly around the cabin for the 3rd time that morning. "I want everything to be right. It is right. It's been right for weeks. You need to breathe, Dad," but breathing was difficult. This felt like the culmination of everything he'd been working toward for the past 6 months. Ruth's approval mattered more than he could articulate. This was her family's story, her history. He'd been the caretaker, but she was the living connection to the people who'd built this place. Ruth arrived on a Saturday morning in early April, driven by her son, David. Reed and Carly stood on the porch as the car came up the access road, and Reed's heart hammered in his chest. The car stopped, and for a moment no one moved. Then the passenger door opened and Ruth stepped out slowly, using a cane for balance. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with white hair and bright eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a practical jacket and sturdy shoes, but there was something elegant about her, a grace in how she carried herself. She looked at the cabin, and her hand went to her mouth. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, my." Reed and Carly waited, letting her take her time. Ruth just stood there, tears streaming down her face, staring at the place where she'd spent the first years of her life. "I didn't think," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't think I'd ever see it again." David came around the car and put his arm around his mother's shoulders. He was about Carly's age, kind-faced and patient. "You okay, Mom?" "Yes. Give me a minute." They all stood in the morning sunlight while Ruth composed herself. Finally, she took a step toward the cabin, then another. She walked slowly to the porch, running her hand along the railing. "Father built this railing twice," she said. "The first one wasn't level. I remember him cursing, which he never did, and tearing it all down to start over. He said if something was worth doing, it was worth doing right." Reed smiled. "He built the whole cabin that way. Every joint, every detail. His craftsmanship is remarkable." Ruth looked at him then, really looked at him, and her eyes were kind. "You must be Reed." "Yes, ma'am." "And this is my daughter Carly." "Thank you," Ruth said simply. "Thank you for caring about this place." Reed led her inside slowly, letting her set the pace. When she crossed the threshold, she stopped again, her eyes moving over everything. The restored logs, the fireplace, the kitchen area, the artifacts displayed throughout. She touched the walls gently, as if greeting an old friend. "It's exactly as I remember," she said. "But better. So much better." Reed showed her the ledger first, open to a page where Joseph had recorded expenses for her birthday in 1951. Ruth read it with trembling fingers. "I was 4 years old. He bought fabric for Mother to make me a dress. I remember that dress. It was blue with yellow flowers. Next were the letters." Ruth read one aloud, her mother's handwriting describing a particularly hard winter. Her voice shook but held steady. "She was so strong," Ruth said. "I didn't appreciate it as a child, but reading this now, she held everything together." When they reached the cradle, Ruth fell silent. She stood looking at it for a long time, then reached out and touched the carved initials on the headboard. "I knew I had a sister who died," she said. "But my parents never talked about it much. They were protecting me, I suppose. I was too young to understand." Reed showed her the letter Miriam had written and left with the cradle. Ruth read it slowly, tears flowing freely now. "She kept the clothes," Ruth whispered. "All these years I never knew she'd kept the clothes. They spent the afternoon going through everything. Ruth told stories about each room, where the Christmas tree had stood, where she'd learned to read, where her brother had carved his initials secretly in the closet doorframe. The memories came in pieces, fragments of a childhood long past, but still present in the bones of the cabin. For lunch, they made tea using recipes from Miriam's box. Ruth laughed when she saw them. These recipes came with us to California. Mother copied them into a new book, but these were the originals. I'd forgotten about the notes she wrote to herself. She read them with affection and sadness. She was trying so hard to keep us all together, to create normalcy when everything felt like it was falling apart. In the afternoon, Ruth asked to see the workshop. Reed led her there, David and Carly following. When Ruth saw Joseph's tools displayed on the wall, she stopped and simply stared. "His hands built everything we had," she said. "Everything. He could look at a problem and just solve it, make something useful and beautiful at the same time." She picked up a handplane, held it like something precious. "I remember watching him use this. I'd sit on the floor of the workshop, and he'd talk to me while he worked. Not about anything important, just talk. The weather, the trees, what we'd have for dinner. I felt so safe when he was working." Reed waited, knowing what had to come next. "Ruth, there's something I need to show you. Something difficult." They went back inside, and Reed brought out the photocopied journal. He explained where he'd found it and what it contained, then let her decide whether to read it. Ruth sat in the reading chair, the journal in her lap, and began reading. Reed, Carly, and David waited in respectful silence. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the occasional turn of a page. When Ruth finally looked up, her face was wet with tears, but her expression was calm. "I always wondered," she said, "why he rebuilt so much in 1953, why he was so driven, so obsessive about getting every detail perfect. Mother told me it was structural concerns, that the cabin needed reinforcement. But I sensed there was something more. I'm sorry if this is painful." "No," Ruth shook her head. "No, I'm grateful. My father was a good man who blamed himself for something he couldn't control. That's a very human thing. And knowing he found a way through it, that he channeled that guilt into making things right, that's beautiful in its own way." She looked around the cabin. "He succeeded, you know. This place is safe and sound and built with absolute care. He did what he set out to do." "Should I have left it hidden?" Reed asked. "Absolutely not. Secrets keep us sick, Reed, even old secrets about people who are gone. This helps me understand my father better. He wasn't perfect. He struggled, but he found redemption. That matters." Ruth stood and walked to the fireplace, placing her hand on the stones above the hearth where the journal had been hidden. "I brought something too," she said. "Something I think belongs here." David brought in a small box from the car. Ruth opened it carefully and lifted out a worn cloth doll, handmade, missing one button eye but clearly treasured. "Mother made this for me when I was 3, Ruth said. "I carried it everywhere. It went with us to California, went with me to college, sat on a shelf in every house I've lived in for 75 years. It's probably the oldest thing I own that I truly love." She held it out to Reed. "I want it to stay here, with the other things, with the story." Reed took it carefully, understanding the weight of what she was offering. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. This place is where my family's story began, where we loved and lost and somehow survived. These artifacts belong together, telling that story." She looked around the cabin. "And I want to give you my blessing for whatever comes next." They sat around the table Reed had built, and Ruth listened as Carly explained the vision. A retreat space for people going through major life transitions, a place where restoration of the cabin and restoration of the self could happen simultaneously. "We'd keep it small," Carly said. "Maybe 2 guests at a time for month-long stays. Dad would be here to guide them, share the story of this place, give them space to do their own rebuilding work." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "What would you call it?" Reed and Carly exchanged glances. They hadn't decided on a name. "The Brennan Cabin Retreat?" Reed suggested. "To honor your family?" Ruth smiled. "No, call it the Mallory Cabin Retreat. You're part of this story now too, Reed. Your restoration work, your own journey, that's what will help people." They need to know that rebuilding is possible, and you're the proof. What about both? David suggested. The Brennan-Mallory cabin, past and present, connected. Ruth considered this, then nodded. I like that. It honors everyone's contribution. She pulled out a folder from her bag. I brought photographs, letters that went with us to California, my father's discharge papers from the war, my brother's school drawings, things I've kept all these years. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through Ruth's materials. Photographs of Joseph and Miriam at different ages, showing the toll the years had taken, but also the deep bond between them. Pictures of Samuel and Ruth as children, smiling despite the hardships. Letters that filled in gaps in the story Reed had pieced together. These should stay here too, Ruth said. Create a complete archive. Let people who come here understand the whole story. The joy and the tragedy, the failure and the redemption. All of it. As evening approached, David suggested they get dinner in town and find a hotel, but Ruth shook her head. I want to stay here tonight, in the cabin, if that's all right with Reed. Of course, Reed said. You can have the guest room. I set it up hoping you'd stay. That evening they cooked together, using Miriam's recipes. Ruth moved around the kitchen with surprising familiarity, her hands seeming to remember where things should be even after 70 years. Mother stood right here, she said, touching the counter. I can almost see her. After dinner, they sat around the fireplace. Ruth talked about her life after leaving the cabin, growing up in California, her father's work as a carpenter, her mother's strength in creating community wherever they went. She talked about her own marriage, her children, the life she'd built. But this place was always with me, she said. In dreams, in memories, it shaped who I became. The hardship taught me resilience. My parents' example taught me that love means staying, even when things are difficult. Reed listened, understanding what she meant. The cabin had shaped him too, in just 6 months. It had taught him about purpose and presence, about the value of patient work and honest effort. Later, after David and Carly had gone to bed in the workshop loft Reed had prepared for them, Ruth asked Reed to walk with her outside. They stood in the clearing under a sky full of stars, wrapped in jackets against the spring chill. My father would be happy to know you're here, Ruth said. That someone cares about what he built, understands what it meant to him. I feel like I know him, Reed admitted. Through his tools, his ledger, his journal. He was a good man. He was. Flawed like all of us, but good. She looked up at the cabin. Make this place what Father would have wanted, Reed. A place where people learn they can rebuild. That falling down matters less than getting back up. That's exactly what we want it to be. Ruth patted his arm. Then you have my complete blessing. Use the artifacts, tell the story, help others the way this place helped you. That's the best way to honor what was here before. The next morning, before Ruth and David left, they held an informal ceremony. Ruth placed her doll with the other artifacts, adding her piece to the collection. Reed showed them where he'd put everything, a display area that told the cabin's complete story chronologically. It's perfect, Ruth said. A living memorial. David pulled Reed aside as they were packing the car. I'm a lawyer, he said. If you're serious about setting this up as a retreat, you'll need proper legal structure. Non-profit status, liability protection, that sort of thing. I'd be happy to help. No charge. Consider it my contribution to the family legacy. Reed was overwhelmed. That's incredibly generous. It's a good thing you're doing. Let me help make it sustainable. As Ruth's car pulled away, she waved from the window. Reed and Carly stood on the porch watching until the car disappeared down the access road. That went well, Carly said. Reed laughed, relief flooding through him. That went better than I could have hoped. They spent the rest of the day making plans. David had given them his card and promised to send legal documents within the week. Carly pulled out her laptop and showed Reed the website framework she'd been developing. The application process, the mission statement, the policies and procedures. We could start accepting applications this summer, she said. Be operational by fall. Reed felt excitement and terror in equal measure. This was really happening. The cabin that had saved him was going to become a place that could save others. That night he sat in the workshop and wrote in his journal. Ruth gave us her blessing today. More than that, she gave us permission to continue the story, to make this place what it was always meant to be, a refuge, a place of restoration and renewal. Joseph and Miriam built this cabin as an act of faith. They believed they could make a life here. When that life turned tragic, they chose to rebuild rather than abandon. Now it's my turn to continue that work, to help others learn what this place taught me, that broken things can be made beautiful again. 6 months later, in early October, the Brennan Mallory Cabin Retreat opened quietly. There was no grand announcement, no publicity campaign, just word of mouth through Phyllis's Historical Society network, through Carly's careful social media documentation, through the few articles that had been written about Reed's restoration work. The applications came in steadily. People who'd lost jobs, gone through divorces, experienced grief or loss, or simply felt unmoored from their lives. Reed and Carly, with input from a small advisory board that included Phyllis and David, reviewed each one carefully. They chose their first 2 guests based not on who had the most dramatic story, but on who seemed most ready to do the work of rebuilding. Beverly Hastings was 52, recently widowed after 30 years of marriage. She'd been a high school art teacher, but had stopped painting herself decades ago, too busy with lesson plans and grading and the daily demands of life. Her husband's sudden death had left her unmoored, questioning who she was outside of being a wife and teacher. Lawrence Chen was 58, laid off after 33 years with the same manufacturing company. He'd defined himself entirely by his work, and without it he felt invisible, worthless. His adult children were concerned enough that his daughter had helped him apply. They arrived on the same grey October morning, exactly 1 year after Reed had first driven up the access road. Reed greeted them on the porch, understanding their nervousness, because he'd felt it too. "Welcome," he said simply. "This is a place for starting over. There's no pressure, no timeline, no expectations. Just space to figure out what comes next." He showed them around, the main cabin where they'd take meals together and gather in the evenings, the 2 guest rooms he'd built, the workshop where tools were available if they wanted to learn woodworking, the trails he'd cleared through the property. "You're welcome to keep to yourselves as much as you want," Reed explained. "But we'll have breakfast together each morning and dinner most evenings. I've found that shared meals help. They create rhythm, connection." Beverly and Lawrence settled in slowly over the first week. Reed gave them space, but was present when they needed him. He shared the cabin's story gradually, showing them the artifacts, reading passages from Joseph's ledger and journal, explaining how the Brennan's experience of loss and rebuilding had informed his own. "The thing is," Reed said one evening as they sat around the fireplace, "Joseph thought his worth was defined by what he built. When he believed his work had caused harm, it nearly destroyed him. I did the same thing, thought being a good provider meant being a good man. Lost my marriage and nearly lost my daughter because I couldn't see the difference." Beverly spoke up quietly. "I did that too. Thought being a good wife and teacher meant putting everyone else first. I stopped being Beverly Hastings somewhere along the way and became just a role. Someone's wife, someone's teacher. When my husband died, I realized I didn't know who I was underneath all that." Lawrence nodded. "When they laid me off, I felt like they'd erased me. Like without that job, that identity, I was nobody." "That's exactly it," Reed said. "And this place, what Joseph and Miriam built, what I've tried to restore, it's about learning that we're more than our roles. That rebuilding is always possible if we're willing to do the work." Beverly started painting again in her second week. She set up an easel on the porch and painted the cabin, the forest, the changing autumn light. Reed would find her there in the mornings, completely absorbed, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been when she arrived. Lawrence gravitated to the workshop. Reed taught him to use Joseph's tools, showing him how to read wood grain, how to fit joints properly, how to sand until the surface felt like silk. Lawrence worked slowly, methodically, building a simple box for his daughter. "She's getting married next spring," he told Reed one afternoon. "I want to give her something I made myself. Not bought, but made." "That's a good gift," Reed said. "The best kind." By the third week, the 3 of them had fallen into an easy rhythm. Mornings were quiet, individual reflection time. Afternoons involved work of various kinds, some alone, some together. Evenings were for gathering, for sharing meals and conversation, for reading by the fireplace or sitting on the porch watching darkness settle over the forest. Reed found himself sharing more of his own story, including the parts that were painful. His failed marriage, his absence from Carly's childhood, the years of working himself into exhaustion while missing what actually mattered. The divorce wasn't bitter, he told them, but it was sad. We'd become strangers, and I knew it was mostly my fault. I'd chosen work over presents over and over until there was nothing left to choose. Have you talked to her since? Beverly asked. Your ex-wife? Some, mostly about logistics at first. But then, after I'd been here a few months, I wrote her an email, just to say I understood my failures, that I took responsibility. I didn't want forgiveness exactly, just wanted her to know I finally saw it clearly. Did she respond? She did. Said she appreciated the honesty, that she hoped I was finding what I needed. It wasn't closure exactly, but it was acknowledgement. That mattered. Lawrence worked on his box in careful silence for a moment, then said, My wife wants a divorce. Told me 2 weeks before I came here. Said she's tired of being married to a shell of a person. Reed and Beverly waited, letting him continue at his own pace. I was angry at first. Like I just lost my job, and now she's leaving too. But being here, listening to your stories, I'm starting to understand. She's right. I've been a shell. I didn't know how to be anything else. Can you rebuild that? Beverly asked gently. I don't know. Maybe not the marriage, but maybe myself. Maybe that's enough to start with. The 4th week, Carly visited to check on things and help with administrative tasks. Beverly and Lawrence were fascinated by the father-daughter dynamic, how easy they were with each other now. You weren't always like this? Beverly asked. No, Carly said. We barely spoke for years. Dad was always working, always distant. I'd pretty much given up on having a real relationship with him. What changed? Carly looked at Reed. He did. He finally stopped running from himself and started doing the actual work of being present. It wasn't instant and it wasn't easy. But it was real. On their last evening before Beverly and Lawrence's month ended, they gathered around the fireplace as they had so many nights before. Reed brought out the guest book he'd created, a leather-bound journal where visitors could write about their experience. You don't have to write anything if you don't want to, he said. But the idea is that your story becomes part of this place's story, continues what the Brennans started. Beverly wrote first, her teacher's handwriting careful and clear. I came here not knowing who I was without my husband. I'm leaving knowing I'm not finished yet. There's still beauty to create and purpose to find. This cabin and the people in it taught me that rebuilding is always possible. Thank you, Reed. Thank you, Joseph and Miriam, whoever you were. Your story gave me permission to start writing my own again. Lawrence's entry was shorter, but no less meaningful. I came here thinking my life ended when my job did. I'm leaving knowing I'm more than what I do for a living. Reed in this place showed me that our worth isn't in our roles, but in our willingness to keep building, keep trying, keep showing up. I'm not fixed, but I'm not broken beyond repair either. That's enough for now. The morning after Beverly and Lawrence left, Reed walked the property alone, coffee mug in hand, watching autumn light filter through the pines. The cabin looked different now, lived in, purposeful. Smoke rose from the chimney. The workshop door stood open. The guest book sat on the table inside, 2 entries recorded, many blank pages waiting. It had worked. The idea that had seemed so uncertain just months ago had proven itself. 2 people had come here carrying grief and loss, and they'd left with hope. Not healed completely, that wasn't the point, but equipped with tools and perspective to continue their own rebuilding. Reed's phone buzzed. A text from Carly. 3 new applications came in overnight. Want to review them together this weekend? He smiled and texted back, yes, come Friday. The Brennan-Mallory cabin retreat had been operating for just 3 months, but already there were 47 people on the waiting list. Stories of divorce, job loss, grief, transition, identity crisis. People searching for what Reed had found here, space to breathe, to think, to rebuild themselves piece by piece. Phyllis visited that afternoon, bringing documents from the Historical Society. The cabin's state historical designation had been approved, which meant protection and access to preservation grants. But more than that, it meant the story was officially recognized as worth preserving. "You've done something remarkable here," Phyllis said, standing in the main room and looking at the artifact displays. "Joseph and Miriam would be proud. I hope so. I think about them often. Wonder what they'd think of all this. I think they'd recognize it. They built this place as an act of faith, believing they could make something lasting. You've continued that work, just in a different form." After Phyllis left, Reed spent the afternoon in the workshop. He was building another guest book. This one would serve as a waiting room journal, where applicants could write about why they wanted to come, what they were hoping to find. David had suggested it as both a screening tool and a way for people to begin their reflection work before even arriving. Using Joseph's tools felt natural now, like picking up a conversation with an old friend. Reed had learned to read the wood, to listen to what each piece wanted to become. The work was meditative, requiring focus that pushed away worry and overthinking. Carly arrived Friday evening with takeout and her laptop. They spread the new applications across the table and read through them together. A 49-year-old woman who'd left an abusive marriage and was trying to rebuild her sense of self. A 62-year-old man who'd lost his wife to cancer and couldn't figure out how to live alone. A 38-year-old who'd suffered a breakdown and was recovering from his second hospitalization. "How do we choose?" Carly asked. "They all need this. We choose the ones we think are ready to do the work. Not the ones with the saddest stories, but the ones who seem prepared to actually engage with the process." They spent 2 hours discussing, debating, finally selecting the next 2 guests. Carly would reach out Monday with invitations. That night they sat on the porch with blankets wrapped around their shoulders, watching stars emerge. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Carly said. "I'm proud of us. This is a partnership. I couldn't do this without you. You know what's funny? A year ago, I couldn't imagine us working together like this. I couldn't imagine us having a real relationship at all. A year ago, I couldn't imagine any of this." Reed gestured at the cabin, the forest, the life he'd built. "I thought I was finished. Career over, marriage over, purpose gone. I was just existing. And now I understand that endings can be beginnings if you let them. That broken things can be made beautiful again if you're willing to do the work." The next morning, Carly left early to drive back to town. Reed stood on the porch waving until her car disappeared down the access road, then turned to look at the cabin. He walked inside, running his hand along the logs Joseph had cut and fitted 80 years ago. He touched the artifacts displayed throughout, the ledger, the letters, the quilt, the wedding photograph, Ruth's doll. Each one a piece of a story that had almost been lost, but was now preserved, honored, continuing. In the workshop, Joseph's tools hung on the wall, ready for the next guest who needed to learn that making something with your hands could heal your heart. In the kitchen, Miriam's recipe box waited to teach another person that creating beauty and normalcy mattered even in hard times. Reed sat at the table and opened his own journal, the one he'd been keeping since his first week here. He'd filled 3 volumes now, documenting not just the cabin's restoration, but his own. He turned to a fresh page and began writing. "1 year ago today, I arrived at this cabin broken and afraid. I'd lost my job, my marriage, my sense of who I was. I came here thinking I needed to escape. But what I really needed was to find something worth caring about, something that mattered beyond myself." Joseph and Miriam built this cabin as an act of faith. They believed they could make a life here. When tragedy struck, they had a choice: abandon everything or find the strength to rebuild. They chose to rebuild. That choice echoed through decades until it reached me, another broken man standing in the ruins of his own life. I didn't just restore this cabin. The cabin restored me. It taught me that our worth isn't in our jobs or our roles, but in our willingness to show up, do honest work, and stay present even when it's hard. It taught me that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Now this place is teaching others the same lessons. Beverly and Lawrence came here lost and left with direction. 47 more people are waiting for their turn. Their stories will become part of this place's story, adding new chapters to something that started long before any of us and will continue long after we're gone. That's what legacy really is, not what we build for ourselves, but what we build that outlasts us, that serves others, that continues growing even when we're no longer here to tend it. Joseph, Miriam, Samuel, Ruth, little Grace who never got to grow up, they're all part of this place's foundation. And now I am too. My story of failure and redemption, of breaking down and rebuilding, joins theirs. And together, all our stories create something larger than any of us alone. This is what I've learned. Sometimes losing everything is how we find what really matters. For me, it took a forgotten cabin in the woods and the story of a family I'd never met. But their story became my story. And now, both stories live on in everyone who comes here seeking their own second chance. Reed closed the journal and placed it on the shelf beside Joseph's ledger. 2 men, 2 eras, same lesson learned through patient work and honest reflection. Outside, voices approached, the next guests arriving early, nervous and hopeful. Reed stood, straightened his shoulders, and went to greet them at the door. The work of restoration, he'd learned, was never truly finished. There was always something broken that needed mending, always someone who needed space to heal and rebuild. And Reed Mallory, at 48, had finally found his purpose. Not in manufacturing or management or any role he'd once thought defined him, but here, in this cabin built by other broken people who'd found their way through, helping others discover what he'd learned, that falling down matters less than getting back up, that broken things can be made beautiful again, that it's never too late for redemption. The cabin waited as it had waited for him, ready to begin again.